On Christmas Day 1946, China National Aviation Corporation, or CNAC, Flight 147 was on a 1,000-mile journey from Chongqing to Shanghai in China. 4 other aircraft were due to land around Shanghai at the same time. However, the weather had other ideas, with the visibility reaching near zero. With limited options, one by one the aircraft made their attempts to land. This day would become the worst single day in early commercial aviation, or as the pilots of CNAC came to know it, Black Christmas. As the dust settled after the end of World War II, countries around the globe embarked on the daunting task of rebuilding. But in China, a different kind of battle raged on. The country was torn apart by its own civil war. On one side, the nationalists, and on the other, the communists. Both sides poured resources into their causes, leaving little financial room for rebuilding or improving infrastructure. In Shanghai, Longwa Airport was a critical hub for China's struggling airlines, China National Aviation Corporation, CNAC, and a Central Air Transport Corporation, CATC. Both airlines had a mix of US and Chinese pilots and crew, with many of the American pilots being ex-US Air Force. They had a number of former US Air Force transport aircraft, which were the Douglas C47 or DC-3 and the Curtiss C46 or Commando. Longwa Airport was far from ideal. It had grass and gravel runways that made it challenging to navigate even on clear days. And in foggy conditions, the airport transformed into a nearly invisible challenge. A lone light at the runway's end offered little guidance, with the pilots relying on a radio beacon as the sole indicator for their approach. Just 15 miles north of Longwa was Qianguang Air Base, which was under US military control, but was for military traffic only, although it could be used in an emergency. Here, air controllers employed a revolutionary technology developed by the British during the war. This was called the Ground Control Approach System, or GCA. It featured 2 oscillating radar antennas. One antenna scans the airspace vertically and the other horizontally, extending up to 30 miles out. In adverse weather, a tower operator could pinpoint inbound aircraft on a radar scope, displaying their lateral and vertical positions. This visual information allowed the controller to guide the pilot, advising on heading and altitude adjustments until the runway became visible. The only problem with it was that at this point, the GCA system was so cutting edge that it wouldn't undergo testing at US airports for another 4 months. We still use this system to this day, although it's known as a Surveillance Radar Approach, SRA, or Approach Surveillance Radar, ASR, but it depends on where you are. William McDonald, CNAC's chief pilot, harboured deep concerns about the safety protocols at CNAC. Over the past 3 years, the region had witnessed a staggering 32 crashes, resulting in the tragic loss of over 100 lives. Determined to enhance safety measures, McDonald advocated for comprehensive training for his fellow pilots, particularly in the use of the Ground Control Approach System at Qianguang in emergency situations. McDonald's insistence on GCA training was driven by a sincere commitment to safety. However, the control tower at Qianguang faced issues with a faulty power supply, and during the autumn of 1946, the radar system was not operational for at least a quarter of that time. 42 CNAC pilots applied to undergo training on the GCA system. However, by the end of the year, only a select few of the 42 pilots succeeded in completing a GCA landing. Of the 5 aircraft heading east, Flight 147 was the last to leave. The captain of the aircraft was Francis Joseph Michiels. He was born in Belgium and learned to fly in the US civilian training program during World War II. He later went on to become an instructor, training US and British military pilots in California before heading to China to join CNAC in September 1945. For this trip, there would be 17 passengers and 3 crew. As much as we complain about the comforts of modern airlines, the seating arrangement for the passengers was on a bench shoulder to shoulder, although you could argue the legroom was much better. Michiels then started the aircraft, and after ensuring everything was operating correctly, took off en route to Shanghai. Shanghai was well known for fog due to its proximity to the sea, but this was usually only in the early morning, clearing as the day went on. However, on this day, Due to a slack wind, the fog was not going to clear. Everything was going as planned, the engines were running nicely, and they were making progress towards their destination. After a while in the cruise, Michiels heard two of the aircraft ahead of him that were due to land in Nanking, which was west of Shanghai. Flight 140, captained by James Greenwood, had attempted to land at Nanking several times, but was unable to visually identify the runway. He continued to circle above, hoping for this to clear, but due to the deteriorating visibility, the airport was forced to close. Flight 115, captained by Rolf B. Preuss, who was just behind Flight 140, was due to land at Nanking. He contacted Greenwood and they decided that their best option was to continue on to Shanghai and land at either Longwa or Qianguan. Michiels in Flight 147 could see the weather picture building. He was aware that the weather wasn't great at Shanghai, but it was likely to clear. Listening to Flights 140 and 115 discuss that the weather at Nanking was too poor to attempt an approach, was starting to increase the worry in the air, and that the options were becoming limited. At this point, Shanghai was still the best option, and with 4 aircraft in front of him, it would soon be made clear which was the best option to take. Flight 48, captained by Tommy Wing, was the first aircraft to arrive at Shanghai. The weather at Longwa Airport was poor. The cloud base was below 100 feet, overcast with fog and rain. Visibility was 50 to 100 feet, and the wind was variable between 0 to 5 knots. Because of this, Flight 48 was given permission to land at Qianguan Air Base, and was instructed to use the GCA approach. Wing had never used the system before, but had no choice but to try and use it. The controllers on the ground held their breath as they waited to see the lights of the aircraft pierce the clouds and illuminate the airfield. Flight 48 made several attempts to land, the sound of the engines building as the aircraft approached and then fading away. Each approach was improving, but with the weather so poor, Wing could not see the runway and lining up with it became increasingly difficult. Wing in Flight 48 attempted another approach. Again, from the ground, the controllers tried desperately to visually identify the aircraft. The sound of the engines was building as the aircraft drew closer. Suddenly, there was a loud explosion, and the light of the fireball filtered through the fog. Flight 48 had struck the roof of a nearby building and crashed. 11 passengers and crew, as well as several people on the ground, lost their lives. Michiels and the other 2 aircraft nearby became aware of the crash of Flight 48. The desperation and pressure was growing in the air and on the ground. 3 aircraft still needed to land, and they only had 2 options: Qianguan or Longwa. Even after the crash of Flight 48, Qianguan remained open, and MacDonald, the CNAC chief pilot, ordered Flights 140 and 147 to land at Qianguan and use the GCA system. With only one beacon available, known as Shanghai Zippo, this meant that the remaining aircraft would need to be separated by altitude whilst holding at the beacon. Flight 140 arrived first at the beacon at 3,000 feet, with Flight 147 at 2,000 feet and 115 at 4,000 feet. Flight 140 was struggling to acquire communication with Shanghai Zippo, and after many attempts, Greenwood in Flight 140 informed Longwa Control that they were very low on fuel and must attempt a landing at Longwa without further delay. He was granted a direct approach and started making his way towards the runway. Michiels was listening and watching while circling at the beacon. At Qianguan, Flight 48 had crashed, and now Flight 140 was on very low fuel and attempting a landing at Longwa. Michiels had also never used the GCA system, so the tension was increasing on all the crews in the air and the controllers on the ground. Listening intently, Flight 140 reported that they were at 1,000 feet and turning south towards the field. MacDonald, the chief pilot, now ordered the ground crew to pour strips of gasoline along the runway and light them to hopefully compensate for the lack of lighting on the runway. The next transmission was from Greenwood, stating that he had lost an engine. From the ground, the controllers now at Longwa were looking and listening out for Flight 140 to emerge through the cloud. The sound of Flight 140 was increasing, with the sound of a sputtering engine cutting through the fog. Suddenly it went eerily silent. Then out of the fog, an orange glow followed by a loud explosion. Greenwood had lined up the aircraft correctly, but the aircraft had run out of fuel and then stalled too close to the ground. Of the 27 passengers and 3 crew, 10 of the passengers survived the crash. From the air, Michiels had seen the orange glow of the crash of Flight 140 and heard on the radio that the second aircraft had gone down. Flight 115, who was circling above Michiels, now left the orbit and headed towards Longwa. Preuss, the captain of Flight 115, was the only pilot out of the 4 in this situation that had experience with the GCA system. However, his aircraft was not equipped with a radio that could transmit on a high enough frequency required to use it. Now perilously low on fuel, he called long final for runway 2 at Longwa. At the same time, Michiels on Flight 147 decided to attempt a GCA landing at Kiangwan Air Base. He left the orbit at 2,000 feet and headed towards the airfield. Now both Flight 147 and 115 were on approach at both Shanghai airfields. Again, the controllers were desperate for the aircraft to land safely and were trying to visually identify the aircraft through the fog. Everyone involved was aware of the previous 2 incidents and knew that the 2 remaining aircraft were in extreme danger. Flight 115 was not happy with his current approach and stated that he would go around again. The sound of the aircraft filled the fog as he passed close to the airfield. The controllers and William MacDonald were listening to the sound of Flight 115 disappear into the mist. Minutes had passed as everyone waited for Flight 115 to arrive. Then, out of the silence, the distant sound of a booming sound could be heard. The tower called Flight 115 but received no response. Flight 115 was lined up correctly for runway 2, but had dipped below the expected glide path. The aircraft struck the top of a school building, causing the aircraft to crash into the ground 1 mile short of the runway. It is believed that Captain Preuss, his radio man, and 6 passengers survived. In pure disbelief, MacDonald and the controllers stood in silence, trying to comprehend what had happened. The silence was then broken by the sound of Captain Michiels' voice. Longwa Tower, this is CNAC 147. Landed Kiangwan 1904. Over and out. Flight 147 had landed safely at Kiangwan. Michiels later reported that he wasn't sure if he saw the runway lights first or touched down first. The determination of the exact death toll for Black Christmas, a term coined by the CNAC pilots, remains challenging. Incomplete records, conflicting eyewitness accounts, and the overwhelming horror of the aftermath led to a significant confusion in record keeping. While several reports suggest a death toll of 62, an official document places it as high as 71. There was one more flight that remained a mystery. Carrying 10 passengers, it had filed a plan for Shanghai, but had never reported in. And for almost 24 hours it was feared lost. Finally, airport staff learned that it had turned around and returned safely to Chongqing. The immediate impact of Shanghai's aviation landscape was profound. Motivated by the horrific crashes and facing the threat of criminal negligence charges from Chinese authorities, airlines took swift action. Within months, a new runway and high-intensity lights capable of piercing through fog were added to Longwa, signalling a commitment to enhancing safety in the wake of the Christmas tragedy. This is not a particularly uplifting Christmas event, but one that I think is important to tell. It shows the commitment of aviators across the world and the challenges early aviation faced. It is also clear to see the improvements in both equipment and safety that the aviation industry has received and how far everything has come. Even though this incident is a tragedy, the pilots in this incident did everything that they could to try and overcome the challenges they faced. And even the fact that there were survivors to the crashes shows the skill the pilots showed to limit the devastation of the event. I hope you found this video interesting, or at the very least found out more information about an incident that you did not know too much about. I hope you're having a fantastic day, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.